welcome to Indoor Shannon. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we're going to do a fun sew along, so stay tuned. Today we're going to be sewing McCall's 7624 in view D. For my dress, I'm going to be using this absolutely stunning fabric from Art Gallery that I was given from Minerva.com. If you want to check out this fabric, I will link it below in the description. The fabrics listed and suggested on the back of the pattern are cotton lawn, crepe, challis, or crepe de chine. You certainly could use any of those as well. I'm using 100% rayon, and the thing with rayon is sometimes it has a tendency to bag out. So there are steps that I'm going to follow to ensure that my dress comes together and fits me correctly. And I will be going over those steps as I sew this pattern. If you're going to be making view D like I am sewing in this video, just know this pattern requires quite a bit of fabric. If you only have fabric that is 45 inches wide, it's going to take 5 3/8 of a yard all the way up to 5 3/4 of a yard to make this dress. If you have a 60-inch wide fabric like I am using, it's going to take closer to 4 yards to make this dress pattern. So just know that going in, that if you choose the full length maxi, it does require a hefty chunk of fabric. All right, it's time to get started. Okay, let's go over the pattern pieces that we're going to need for view D. You're going to need pattern piece number 2, which is your front waistband. You need to cut 4 from your main fabric and 2 from your interfacing, and go ahead and interface 2 pieces of your waistband. You need pieces 4 and 5, which are the bodice front and bodice back, and you need to cut 2 from your bodice front and 1 from number 5 on the fold for the back. For pattern piece number 11, which is your skirt front, you're going to want to cut 2. Pattern piece number 12, which is your skirt back, cut 1 on the fold. Piece number 6 is the tie end. You'll want to cut 2 from the fabric. Piece number 10 is your sleeve band. You're going to cut 2 from your fabric and 2 from your interfacing, and go ahead and apply the interfacing on the back of those bands. Piece number 14, which is very long for view D, you're going to need to cut 2 from your fabric and 2 from your interfacing. This step takes a while to apply all that interfacing. And piece number 15, you're going to cut 2 from your fabric and 2 from your interfacing and apply the interfacing onto your pieces. Make sure that when you're cutting your pattern, you cut all of your notches into the pattern pieces, and then we're going to get ready to transfer any markings. You're also going to need piece number 13, which is your guide for your elastic. Okay, now it's time to transfer all of our little circles onto our pattern piece. I'm going to show you one way that you can do this. You could use transfer paper, but I'm just going to show you a quick method here using a pin. So I'm going to put my pin in that circle, and then I'm just going to pull back my pattern piece on both sides so I can see where it is, and put a little mark using a fabric marking tool. What I'm using to mark are these friction pens. These are erasable by heat. They're not specifically meant for fabric, but a lot of people do use them in the sewing world. They're made by Pilot, and I will link them down below. Go ahead and continue transferring all your marks and notches onto your pattern, and then we'll get started sewing our bodice together. Before you get started sewing, make sure that you've replaced your needle in your machine and make sure it matches your project. Since I'm using this lightweight rayon challis, I'm going to be using a Microtex needle at the size 70-10, and this will be a nice sharp needle to hopefully prevent any snags. We want to take a note of a couple things on our pattern. We want to look at our seam allowance, which is going to be 5/8 of an inch unless it tells us otherwise. And the rest of this glossary and notes we can refer back to as needed. So we want to begin with our instructions, which talk about the bodice and the waistband, but you can see they begin by talking about views A and B all the way up through this step. So we're actually going to go onto the second pattern sheet, which is page 3, and look at step number 9 to begin. Step number 9 tells us this is for views C and D, and then we want to gather that lower edge of the bodice front between those small circles. You should have marked your small circles in our last step, so now you want to take that to your machine, and with a long straight stitch, you want to stitch in between the dots and then pull the threads to gather. Okay, I put my gathering stitch in between the two small dots. Since I'm using a fabric which is 100% rayon and it tends to grow and stretch out, I went ahead and put a row of stay stitching or a line of stay stitching in here around the neckline just to help prevent stretching out. Next, we're going to take one front bodice piece and one number 2 waistband piece that is interfaced, and we're going to lay them right sides together matching. So you can see our dots here are going to line up with the small dots where you gathered, and this other dot is going to be the large dot that you transferred. So you want to lay those right sides together and then adjust your gathers so that this piece fits from the front of the bodice to this little underarm section. Once you have that gathered to fit, go ahead and pin it, and you're going to baste this part together. Once you're finished, it's going to look something like this. You'll want to go ahead and repeat it on your other bodice front. Okay, now you should have 2 pieces with the waistband basted on. You're going to take one of your pieces and you're going to turn it wrong sides up and take your remaining piece that was not interfaced for your waistband, and you want to sew this one right sides together. So the right side of the fabric is going to be facing the wrong side of the bodice, and you want to again have those 2 dots matching where you gathered and this other dot with the big circle. Once you have that in place, you're going to stitch this on at 5/8 of an inch and repeat it on the other bodice. Okay, once you have those 2 facing pieces stitched on, they're basically sandwiching your bodice in between. And what you're going to want to do is, after you stitch that on, go ahead and trim this seam allowance down, and then open it up so that the facing side, which is in the back, is upright facing you, is how I like to do this part. And you're just going to stitch all of this seam allowance from your stitching right next to your stitching line, about 1/8 of an inch away. Keep making sure that this facing piece is straight. You can also do this from the right side, and you'll just want to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away all the way down this facing piece, holding all that seam allowance. That would be called understitching. When you're done, if you're looking at it from the right side, there is your facing piece, and on the back you can see the understitching line there on the back, and that will be what it looks like from the inside view. Okay, you want to take it to your iron and press this down, and then you want to take your 2 waistband pieces and just put a basting stitch all the way around to hold that down. Make sure you do that on both front bodice pieces. Then we're going to move to the back bodice. Okay, for the next step, you want to find your bodice back and simply open it up and put a row of stay stitching around your neckline so that it doesn't stretch out. And place it to the side. Next, you want to get out your 2 tie pieces. You're going to begin by folding it in half and taking it to your iron to press. Once you've done that, you're going to take it to your machine, and you'll notice there's a dot on one side of the tie. Basically, you're going to sew the ties the opposite way so that one goes on one side of the bodice and one goes on the other side when you're done. So leaving the side with the dot open, whichever one that is for your marked piece, you're going to start at one end and you're going to sew up the short end, then pivot and sew all the way down your long edge. Once you've done that, you're going to trim your seam allowance and turn it right side out. If you don't already own one of these tube turners, get yourself one. It is well worth the few dollars. Here's how you use one of these. You simply take the plastic piece, and mine has 3 sizes, and you're going to slide whatever you need to turn onto that. And then mine comes with this little skewer. You want to do this gently so you don't rip any fabric, but you just stick it in and pull it right side out, and it's as simple as that. Then you can take that corner part of the stick and gently turn out your corners. Once you've done that, you'll want to repeat this for the other tie. Again, making sure you leave the opposite side open and press it well. Okay, the next step is to take that bodice back piece and lie it out flat, and you should have marked your 2 dots from your pattern piece and transferred them here. And now you're going to take your ties that you just created and you want to pin them to these back dots. So this is the side that is sewed closed, and so I want that laying out this way away from it, and I want to take the raw edge and line it up on top of my dot here with the raw edges even. I want to pin it here and baste it on, and then I'm just going to repeat then I'm going to repeat the same thing for the other side. So I want the side that is sewed and closed not to be attached, and instead I'm going to pin the top of it at that dot and the raw edges even and baste on that side. Okay, we're on to step 17, and we're going to attach our front and back bodices together. Traditionally, you would be doing this with the right side of your fabric facing up and then the right side of your bodice lying on top to match the shoulder seams and the underarm seams. And you'd stitch those together in 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then it wants you to stitch one more time on the underarm to reinforce. You certainly can do it that way. The reason mine is reversed is I'm going to be using French seams to finish off this more delicate fabric. So to do that, if you want to follow along with me for French seams, you're going to lay your pattern pieces out like you're wearing them. So you actually want wrong sides together here, and I'm just going to do one section at a time. We're going to start with the shoulder. What you want to do is pin and stitch at 1/4 of an inch all the way across the shoulder. Once you've done that, you can trim it down to about 1/8 of an inch, but it should be fine at 1/4 of an inch if you stayed really straight. And then you're going to press it, the right sides together, encasing that seam allowance, and then stitch that at 3/8 of an inch. That way you have the 1/4 inch, which is the same as 2/8, and the 3/8 inch added together to make a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So it works well with a 5/8 inch seam allowance pattern. It does take a little bit more time, but it gives a nice delicate finish. So I'm going to show you how I do this part on my machine and with the iron. But again, if you would rather just do it the traditional way, just put your bodice and back pieces right sides together and stitch your shoulders and your underarm, and you're done with this step. So I'm starting with that shoulder seam that I pinned, and I'm going to sew it first at 1/4 of an inch. So now I want to take this, and I'm just going to trim this down about halfway so it's 1/8 of an inch. So I have it sewn together with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I trimmed it down. Now I'm going to press my seam towards one side. You want to press it one direction, then turn it back on itself, and putting that line of stitching, that seam allowance that you just created, right at the top of the shoulder. You want to press it again, and what you're doing is encasing what will be that seam allowance. So what is inside there right now is that 1/8 inch of fabric that you trimmed down. So now you're going to take this to your machine, and using a 3/8 of an inch stitch, you're going to stitch this again. Okay, so there is the enclosed seam. And now when you turn it to the right side, you shouldn't be able to see any of that first line of stitching. And now this is nice and neat on the inside and won't show any fraying or raveling. And it looks beautiful from the outside as well. I've decided for the underarm area to skip doing the French seam so that I didn't have bulk around this corner. And instead what I did is I sewed the seam allowance and then sewed a second row of stitching and trimmed it down so that it's real close. It's almost like a faux French seam from far away. So that's the technique that I decided to do to finish. So now I'm going to go ahead and install the other front bodice piece. I am still going to do the French seam on the shoulder and then this different technique on the underarm area. So we've now finished putting together our bodice, and we are on to the armhole edges. So for view D, we're going to come all the way over here to number 30, which is to work with our sleeve band. Okay, it's now time to install this sleeve band, and I'm going to change the directions up slightly just because I feel like this makes it a little simpler to install. So prior to stitching the two short ends together, I actually want you to take it to your machine and press it in half because you're going to need that later. And then take the bottom unnotched edge and press it up 3/8 of an inch. And by doing these memory presses, it's going to make it a lot easier to install when it's time to put it in. So now that you've pressed it up, you want to take it and turn it out, unfold your pressing line at these edges, so that you stitch the entire side now together at a 5/8 inch. And then we're going to install it per the instructions. So go ahead and do the 5/8 inch seam allowance now, and then I'll show you how to install it. Okay, so now you've trimmed that seam allowance down. And now with your seams that you already have memory pressed into place, you can easily fold those back along those memory presses. And we want to install this so that the side with the memory press at 3/8 of an inch is going to be slid on top of our sleeve, and our underarm is going to have this seam allowance from the sleeve facing. There's also 2 notches on the back of the sleeve that should match up with the 2 notches in your sleeve facing. So you'll go ahead and slide this on top so it'll be right sides together. Then take some pins and pin it all the way around and sew at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, you've now sewn it on with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and you want to trim this seam down as well. Okay, and now that you've trimmed that down, you're going to use that memory press that you already did earlier to help you with this next step. You're going to want to take it to your iron and press. Let's turn it wrong sides out. So you're going to want to take it to your iron and press this seam right here that you attach the sleeve facing towards the facing side, not towards the sleeve. So go ahead and do that next. And then you're going to use that memory press that you did to just fold this down and cover that. And you can see how nicely it's already folding for you because you've done it when it was flat. And then you can pin that down, and that's going to be hand stitched. Or if you choose, you could do this by machine. It's now time to begin skirt construction. You're going to have 1 center back piece that's been cut on the fold of your skirt and 2 skirt fronts. We're now going to attach the 2 skirt fronts at the 2 side seams from the waist all the way down to the hem. I'm going to do mine with a French seam. You can do this in your preferred stitch, but you'll want to stitch it at 5/8 of an inch, and go ahead and do it now. Okay, typically the next step would be step 36, which is to make our narrow hem at the bottom. However, I'm not going to do that because I am using rayon, which often stretches out over time. So I'm going to let mine hang for 24 hours before I put in the final hem. But if you are not using something like that, you can go ahead and add your 5/8 inch narrow hem at this time if you'd like. What I'm going to move down to is pinning the skirt to the bodice. And to do that, we want to match the centers, the side seams, and we're going to adjust those gathers that we put in, which I just realized I forgot to mention. Okay, after you have sewn the side seams for your skirt, you want to go ahead and put a gathering stitch in along the top of the skirt all the way across. You can do that with whatever method you'd like. So since we're skipping that final hem right now, we're going to go ahead and lay out our skirt right side up. And then we want to take our bodice, and we're going to be laying that right side together with our skirt bottom. We want to match up our side seams and mark them, and then gather up our skirt so that it fits the same width going across. Once we have it all the way across and pinned, we're going to go ahead and baste it check and make sure that our gathers look nice, and then come back and stitch it again. When going to baste your gathers, I prefer to do this with the gathered side facing me. That way I can kind of keep track if I need to move things around and make sure nothing's getting caught up in the seam allowance. So just use the ruffled side or the gathered side facing up at you so you can keep track of that as you go, and make sure that you do that baste first and double check that nothing got caught up in there or nothing is strange before you put in your final line of stitching. Okay, for the next step in our directions, we're going to be inserting our elastic. The instructions call for 1/4 inch elastic. I only have 3/8 on hand, so I'm going to make it work. And to do this, we're going to be inserting the elastic just between the two side seams along the back seam allowance. And I don't want to leave this this seam looking this unfinished. So I'm going to try a technique after inserting the elastic and see if it works. So the first thing that you want to do is go from your one side seam to your other and sew right along that top of the raw edges to sew those two sides together to create a casing. And that's going to be where you're going to insert your elastic. So go ahead and just sew between the two side seams along this top edge to enclose your elastic. Okay, so now I've sewn along the top, so I've created this casing, and I want to use my elastic guide here. And I'm actually going to go with a little bit smaller. I have been cutting the size 12 bottom. I'm going to do the 10 for the elastic because I feel like my top is a little loose when I've kind of tried it on. So go ahead and cut your elastic for that. Then using a safety pin or any of your favorite bodkins or anything to get your elastic through, you're going to feed that through from where your casing ended, which should be right at one side seam, through to the other side seam. Keep your eye on this end and make sure you don't pull it through. So now before we go any further, you're going to take that end and you're going to pin it securely on this side. It's easiest just to take another safety pin and pin it on your side seam so that it doesn't go any further into the casing. And then take this side and bring it out of your casing and pin it onto this side seam. Then you want to take it and try it on and make sure that your fit is how you want it before you sew it into place. So go ahead and after you feed it through, try it on, make any adjustments to make it tighter as needed or loosen it up. Once you've tried on your elastic and made sure that it fits, you want to go ahead and go back over and make sure that you're stitching the elastic to stay in the casing on each side. Now, to make the interior of your dress look a little bit neater, you certainly could just run this across a serger if you have one. I'm going to choose not to do that because I'm a little concerned that I will cut off too much of this where the casing is. So I'm going to use a Hong Kong finish instead on this seam line. It looks nice and neat and just adds an extra little finish. So to do this, I'm going to take double fold bias tape, and this is a narrow double fold bias tape. So now it's time to work on our Hong Kong finish. What you're going to do is take that bodice and waist seam and flip it up so that you're working on the underside. You're going to lay your piece of bias tape with the right sides onto this underside and just stitch right along this first crease line. And after you've done that all the way across, you're going to go back, trim it down with your scissors so that all of your seam allowance is now even with the seam allowance from the bias tape. Then you're going to press it up in this direction. And then finally, you're going to take it to your iron and you're going to press it back on itself so that it is covering, it's going to be past that stitching line. And the reason you want it past that stitching line is now you're going to take your machine after you've pressed this well and you're going to go back and stitch right here in the ditch. That means you're going to put your needle right into that seam line so that you don't see it on the cream and you don't see it on this part of the dress. So you want to do as best as you can to stay right in the seam line. Once you have that done, you'll have a nice clean seam. It'll be raw from this side. You'll see this flapping, and that's fine. But then what we're going to do is press our seam allowances up so that the only side that will be seen is this nice clean inside like that. And like I said, this is an extra step. This is certainly not something that you have to do. It's just another way to help keep the lines clean. I'm going to have to come back here and tack this into place, but this is how I'm choosing to finish it because of this center elastic part needing to be sewn into the casing. And I just think that it's going to make that look a whole lot cleaner on the inside of my dress. So I'm going to go ahead and press my now, stitch in the ditch, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, it's now time to insert our front band. We're going to skip all the way over to number 48, which is view B and D. So for your band, you should have cut out 2 pieces and interfaced it of the band. Now, I am short on interfacing, so I only interfaced 1 piece, but that is not following the instructions. What you need to do now is lie your 2 band pieces face to face so that the front sides are touching, and you should have transferred your marks. And you have a mark here, and then you should have one a little bit further down here. And what you're going to do is, having those 2 together, you're going to sew from this to this mark, making sure you're doing forward stitching and back stitching at each one, and you're just going to sew down that center line of the bands. Okay, once you've put in your line of stitching, now you're going to turn our facings onto themselves, I believe, which that's going to be a problem because that's going to mean not interfacing this one side. It's going to be too obvious. Ew. Yep. Okay. Now I see why you have to interface it. So come to find out, it's very important that you put your interfacing on both sides because the way that you press it out, it will be obvious if only one of your bands is interfaced. So don't make the mistake that I did. I had to go back and use scraps to fill in the one side, but you know what? We made it work. So before I can pin it to this, I realized, so these pieces right here actually should be sewn together. So I obviously missed that back in, I'm not sure exactly where you're supposed to do this step. It almost seems like you should have done the view B steps of stay stitching and then turning in the band and all of this pressing. It seems like I should have done that and along with step 45, but I'm gonna go ahead and do it now, even though it tells you not to start until view B and D, but hey, I guess that's why this part people say is a little bit confusing. So I'm gonna turn this band back on itself on this side, and this is where the stitching line in the pattern, probably where that stitching line is going to come from right there in that V. So we're going to be stitching from that point up. Go ahead and turn that back on itself. I apologize that I didn't catch that before. Okay, I apologize that this video is a little bit out of order, but now I understand what the reviewers meant when they said that this band part was a little confusing. The way that it is written, it makes you feel as though this is just for view B and that you can ignore these steps until you come over to view B and D. But that's actually not the case. So mine was done out of order. If you were to be doing this correctly, you should do the stay stitching. You should turn in the seam allowance on what the long unnotched edge and then trim it to 3/8 inch. So I'm gonna have to do that still on mine. And then with the bands right sides together, actually sew together this portion of it. And that is where the instructions, I feel, are a little bit lacking, because then it jumps. So when you are sewing this together, if you're doing it the right way, is prior to sewing this middle seam, you're actually going to have, I guess, the top of your Ys, for lack of a better explanation, put right sides together. And this is where you're going to want to follow this stitching line and trace it onto your pattern piece. So you can see it's going to go down here to a point. And that point is going to intersect with the point that you sew from that dot all the way down later. So I had to go backwards and do mine after the fact and kind of work on this area to make it look the way that I thought looked okay. So now I'm going to work backwards again. So I'm trying to explain this as if I didn't miss all these steps. So let's pretend that nothing is sewn together. And I am going to assume that my facing side back here needs to be trimmed down to 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to be turning it up. So basically this is again going to be that 5/8 of an inch line that I'm going to sew down with my thread, then I'm going to trim it down by 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to press it up by to a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to do that on that outside edge, going all the way down my band. And then at the lower edge, once I get there, I'm also going to turn this side in like that, like I'm turning in my hem. This part I'm not quite as worried about, because I think I'm going to have to kind of fiddle with mine since it's rayon and it's probably stretching out a little bit. So I apologize that mine is out of order. Basically what you'll want to do is follow the instructions for this stay stitching and for this trimming down the seam allowance on the facing piece, and then stitching together the top of that Y on each side. And then you're going to go where I started, which is sewing that center dot piece. So I apologize for the confusion. So then we're going to move to that back band. Okay, now we're moving on to piece number 15, which is our back neck band. So it says on here all views, and then it says view B, and that's kind of confusing. D. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our 2 neck bands and place them right sides together, and we're going to stitch them together at the neck with our 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, next it's going to ask you to trim your seam allowance. Just going to cut it down to about 1/4 inch. And I'm going to put a few clips in mine just because when working on a curve, this is going to help it turn in much easier. Okay, so now it's asking us to turn in the seam allowance on one band, and this can be kind of difficult to do when you're working on a curve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a line of stitching right here at 5/8 of an inch, which is where it wants me to turn it in. And then it's going to tell me to press this and trim this down to 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to go ahead and kind of cheat here now and cut off this 1/4 inch seam allowance now, just so I'm not easing in even more fabric, but you could wait and do this after you pressed it. So now that I have it trimmed down to 3/8 inch of a seam allowance left, I'm going to go and take it to my ironing board, and I want to turn it in right on that line that I pressed, and sewing that in is just going to help me know exactly where I need to guide it in and ease in this fullness. Okay, so I've now pressed up that side right along my stitching line. Okay, now we're going to open this all the way back out, including our pressed seam allowance. Okay, so I went back through, and on that facing side, I put a stitching line at 5/8 inch. Then I pressed up onto that line, and now I'm going to trim it down so that it's just 3/8 of an inch for the seam allowance. Okay, so it's now time to attach our back neckband to the front. And you can see one side has been turned under, which is your facing side, and that's going to line up with the facing of your back neckband. So now we want to attach these right sides together, and we want to match the full unpressed neckband side, and then the two facing sides by opening out the facing. Okay, so those should be pinned across like this, and then you'll want to go ahead and pin it across to your other side of your neck, and you're going to stitch across with 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, once you've sewn those together, you want to take it and then press it so that it now looks kind of like a large keyhole, and this is your neckband, and we're going to get ready to insert this into the dress, and we're going to stitch it by putting right sides together. So that would be not the facing side. We want to put the right sides of this unpressed side of the band to the right side of our front. Okay, a couple things. One, don't put it on your dress form to pin. This dress, although quite loose, is actually kind of tight through here to get off over a dress form, at least on my form, through the chest and the shoulder area. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. And then I would recommend at this point just basting this neckline on and trying it on like I am now. What I am finding with mine is this is a nice relaxed loose style, but it is almost too relaxed that I feel like I couldn't really wear anything except for like a cami like this underneath it without being completely exposed. So make sure that you're trying it on. I'm finding it's just kind of too loose through the front top for me, and I'm thinking of a couple ways that I may go about altering it. For me, I think the easiest alteration is going to be to pinch out through this shoulder seam, which means this is obviously just basted together so I can easily remove the neckband and shorten the neckband area. That's a simple fix. The facing, unfortunately, of the sleeve would have to come out so that I could fix that, or I may just taper it back out if I could, depending on how much I pinch out. But I'm thinking that may be the easiest adjustment, and pull this up a little bit more so that it doesn't gape so much. But I definitely recommend basting the neckline in, especially so you can match up this area so that they're even with each other before you put on everything for the final time. Okay, we're now at the part of our dress where we're going to be working on this hem. If you remember, I did this out of order because I'm using a rayon fabric that tends to stretch. So I only sewed those front bands on until, 5 to 10 inches away from the bottom hem, and then I paused. I went back and I evened my hem of the dress, or I made my hem even on the bottom of the dress, and I serged around, pressed up 5/8 of an inch, and sewed that hem. Now we're going to come back to the bands, and what you want to do is put your band with your dress. Let me move this one out of the way so you can see it a little bit better. You're going to match your band with your dress, and you want to press it up the seam allowance so that it's exactly in line with the hem of the dress. And now what you want to do is, with the hem pressed up on your band, you're going to finish stitching the front band down all the way to the hemline. So go ahead and do that on both sides. And then once you've done that, we're going to, I'm going to choose to serge this all the way around. You don't have to finish that part, but if you want to, this is when you would do that. Okay, the final step in your dress is attaching that front band down. So what you're going to do is after you've serged this seam, or if you chose to leave it raw, you want to press it towards the front facing. Once you've done that, you're going to fold your facing back over it, making sure you're just covering that first row of stitching that you put in. And this is where you can use this seam tape again and just put the row right here to hold it, because I'm going to choose to stitch this by the front, I'm going to choose to stitch mine by machine, going right in the stitching in the ditch like I did for the arm facing. However, if you don't want to do that, you would be hand sewing all the way around your neckband at this point after pressing it. So choose the way that you would like to finish. When you're done, I think it would be wise to go back and just kind of slip stitch this bottom hem together where that facing is, just to give that a nice finish through there. And other than that, you'll want to give it a final press, clip any threads, and enjoy your new dress. Thank you so much for being here for this sew along of this McCall's pattern. You may be wondering why I made a sew along for a pattern that was released probably several years ago. It is because when I was doing my own research for my dress, I could not find many sewing pattern reviews for this dress that didn't mention that the front band was a little bit confusing for them to put together. So I thought it would be helpful to put together a sew along to watch that construction. I know myself, even sewing for almost 20 years, I still enjoy watching other people sew. I always learn something new, and I don't know, I just find it fascinating. So I hope that this was helpful for you. As you saw in the video, I also messed up on that band and had to go back and show you the corrections. So I hope seeing my mistake helps you avoid any mistakes for yourself, and that overall when you put this dress together, it will be a breeze for you. So thank you so much for joining along. Make sure you like or subscribe so that you can see when any new videos come along, and check out indoorshannon.com for many more sewing pattern reviews, tutorials, tips, all kinds of things there. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, happy sewing.